Hello, this is Jim Schaefer, the host and executive producer of Rip Rap, the academic book television program. Our guest today is Randy Baier, a frequent contributor to Rip Rap, and we're going to go through some of the books that we've collected over the past year. Books that we were not able to do interviews on and talk about what our interest is in them. One of the first books I've got is The Politics of Ethics in an Age of Terror, The Lesser Evil by Michael Ignatieff. I picked up this book because I was interested in this whole issue of law, torture, terror that we're going through in this country right now. It's quite a significant issue, and I was fascinated with how he approaches it.
My first question about this was, what do you do about the nature of violence in response to violence? And apparently he has sort of tried to define the limits of, he says that violence may be necessary, but it certainly shouldn't be accommodating terror and retribution or revenge.
How far can you go in defending yourself against terror before you become a terrorist yourself, promoting or exploiting terror in your own society? And it's a very difficult thing, because today, as we sit here, President Bush has admitted that he permitted the National Security Agency to do surveillance on all the telephone conversations coming in and out of the United States, even from people who live in the United States. And that raises a real question about political rights.
So The Lesser Evil is a fitting title. That segues to this other one that came up in your list, Protecting Liberty in an Age of Terror. The same idea as what you were just alluding to, by Philip Hyman and Juliette Kayyem. Appendix here, there's kind of a legal brief almost called Torture and Coercive Interrogations, and a very well-documented annotated discussion of the background to that.
Well, one of the issues
issue
in this book and in that appendix is the whole thing raised about the memos by Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld and others, trying to justify rather harsh interrogation. Again, it fits in with the Ignatieff book, that they felt that, well, because this was terrorists that they felt were involved, they could use very severe methods. What they point out in this book, though, is, again, there's this issue of liberty and the protection of individual rights, and that there is a point where what you're doing is torture, and then you've, again, left the realm of even-handed jurisprudence,
Yes,
and
right.
you've gone into a whole nother realm.
Not to mention that the people who are sort of in an accused state but not a proven state, so you don't really know to what degree their terrorism actually is.
Well, what I thought was fascinating is that the authors point out that the scholarship is very minimal on terror and on coercive interrogations. And part of the difficulty is, how are you going to document, the cases involved with this? So it's very urgent that we have some more research studying these issues. It's a very touchy subject, but it's something that I think people are going to have to take a look at, because as those who've been reading the news reports lately know, the situations in the prisons in Iraq, at Abu Ghraib, for example, and other places, are issues like cultural torture, in the sense that if you're in a religious tradition that really frowns upon any kind of nakedness in front of other people, and then you're forced to be naked and do unnatural and very blatant sexual acts, if that doesn't then so violate your sense of being and your religious principles.
Equates to torture,
right,
in that cultural view.
And right now that's what's being gone through. I read the memorandum on that, the report by James Schlesinger. It's a very serious issue. Here's another book that's relevant to this topic, the book Democratizing the Global Media, One World, Many Struggles by Robert Hackett and Zui Zhao. And this has to do with a process of globalization, but what does it mean to have global media? Just extending the reach of the media isn't quite enough. And I'm not sure whether we're democratizing it or we're just globalizing it. I think there's somewhat of a difference.
This book goes through The subtitle is One World, Many Struggles. It talks about sort of the outlook of media from many different countries and sort of cultural points of view. And it is meant to, I think, take a look at sort of what we were talking about a moment ago, about the sort of different perceptions of how media interprets information, what information is, and how, in a sense, how it's proselytized, you know, in the particular culture, for instance, India, how media is affected there, but then when it interacts in a global manner, such as, I suppose, one of the ones that comes to mind would be Al Jazeera, how it sort of has a cultural view that's distinctly from that region, which really, and yet it has a global reach, and it's bringing out things that our media, meaning the media in the West, may not even attempt to pursue or look at.
Well, I also think that there's some fascinating dynamics going on in the media at the global level. For example, in the United States, there are only 7 companies that really own all of the commercial media, and that has an impact on what's covered, because all of those companies also have a vested interest in waging war.
Yeah.
Another thing is that BBC has just realigned its coverage so that they're going to be forming this new channel to deal with Arabic affairs, and they're closing down other operations that they had done before, which also speaks to their attempt to shift the configuration of what they're doing. So it's some really interesting things going on, and they have a huge impact. Another thing I was thinking about earlier this year is that we've had hurricanes and other storms hit places like Louisiana and Alabama and Florida and that area. And perhaps 1,000 people died there as a result of those storms. But there was another earthquake that hit South Asia, especially Pakistan, and there were almost 90,000 people killed. And now many people in the West, including the United States, have already forgotten about the Asian dead, even though that number of dead is 10 times higher. It was convenient for the media report on the hurricanes here in this country. It's not so convenient to go to desolate, distant places in Pakistan that are up in the mountains. And so as a result, people don't have any awareness of what's going on.
And we have this idea of democratizing from sort of, in a sense, not imposing, but certainly the Western or American view of democracy and what a democratic media would mean is entirely, in a sense, imposed and sometimes even considered to be imposed. Speaking of globalization, our next book here is discussion of NGOs worldwide, Global Humanitarianism, NGOs and the Crafting of Community, by D. Robert Jashane. This takes another approach to various aspects of humanitarian action, and how one interesting chapter is on the rhetoric of humanitarian action, looking at the landmine issue worldwide and how that's been sort of couched in various types of terminology to affect action in many, many different countries, but to get a global reach. And in fact, there's this other chapter I'm looking at is called Framing Humanitarian Action, discussing how Doctors Without Borders, for instance, engages on a global scale, and what it means to build some kind of a world community or an idea of a world community.
I was fascinated with this book because we've recently had some truly global disasters. Disasters like earthquakes and hurricanes and floods and fires and that kind of thing. Who responds? How they organized? And who defines what is the emergency, and what's the appropriate response to it?
Well, like your example about Pakistan and related to the media, it's also like exactly who's determining what level of response will happen.
And who can provide relief and necessary resources in the ways that the affected people can use them. In Pakistan, I heard that they desperately needed winter tents because winter was beginning and snow was starting to fall. And I didn't realize it, but there's only a limited number of tents, winter tents, in the whole world that could be shipped there. and they got all of the tents that were available, and there still weren't enough. I mean, there was something like 100,000 people who were homeless in that area.
They're just not
So
they're
this
not
whole
there.
notion of, well, how do you do this, and then how do the NGOs and non-governmental organizations, how do they work with the governmental organizations? And it's just an awful challenge, I think.
Right. How the cows turned mad. Do you want to, have you taken a look at that one?
Yeah, this is kind of a fascinating thing because it kind of fits in with kind of some of the disasters going on. Of course, the mad cow syndrome came from a virus that people would get from certain diseased cows, and it would literally riddle those people's brains with holes, and then they would die. But that kind of medical disaster is similar to other situations like the bird flu disease. This book raises questions about these kinds of global disasters and how do you respond to them. The United States has got involved in this because if you have meat shipped from another country to the United States from like Canada or something, do you ban all the meat? Because it's not something you can really distinguish easily.
Yeah.
So
And the economic impact, obviously, is enormous. This talks about the history of the virus, sort of tracking. It's almost like a detective story about the virus, which is not just something that happened in the 80s. It actually goes back 3 centuries. And there's a really interesting chapter on the anthropology of the disease called Kuru and the discovery of the disease in the 50s in Papua New Guinea, what is now Papua New Guinea, among the foray peoples in New Guinea. It was a kind of a nerve disease that was affecting them, and then there was, they go into the epidemiology of it, which it's related to the mad cow disease, but it's sort of the history of the uncovering of the disease, but I think it's more from a cultural, as much a cultural as it is a epidemiological type of discussion.
the other thing that's fascinating to me is that we live in this age of modern technology, and we still have these disasters that we cannot predict and that are absolutely debilitating. This is the book we were talking about just before the program, The Political Life of Medicare by Jonathan Oberlander. And now we are surely into the age of Medicare and trying to take a look at it and its financial health. And Congress has just opened up the new prescription package or option that people think will cost as much as $160 billion more. And people don't understand how that interacts with their own health plan if they have one. So this is becoming quite an issue.
I heard one of our Michigan representatives, Representative Dingell, discuss how completely confused he was by the prescription plan. And he said, I'm definitely taking it back to committee. But that's just the tip of the iceberg, because this is affecting, this being the political life of Medicare, is talking about how, how it is going to sort of affect our social life, our futures, our work life as well, and the fact that so much is invested that you can't actually get returns on.
Yes, and there's so much confusion over how to handle the safety net issues like health benefits, Social Security, pensions, all these kinds of social assistance programs. Why, at this very moment, IBM is freezing all of its pension benefits. The major car manufacturers are talking about freezing health care benefits and having retirees pay more for medicine. Plus other employers are cutting back.
In fact, I think you were telling me that the pension plans are costing more than
The unfunded liability.
In fact, the investments they have to make are a major draw on their bottom line, which is unfortunate. There's got to be a way to solve it. I guess this book is an attempt, at least, to look at the background to it. In Senghor's Shadow, Jim, Art, Politics, and the Avantgarde in Senegal, 1960 to 1995, by Elizabeth Harney. This is a look at art, cultural and artistic politics of new art in Senegal, and the effect of the poet Senghor, who was president of Senegal, but also a great poet in his own right. Many discussions of the effect of avant-garde art from the West and avant-garde art from other areas of Africa and its impact on Senegalese culture.
It's always fascinated me by what we call avant-garde. You know,
It's a great question.
something that's
also
avant-garde.
It's a 35-year history, so you'd think avant-garde would like sort of be, okay, well, you're 1 year away, so in 60, what was the avant-garde? In 94, what was the
But
avant-garde?
I've always wondered if avant-garde was just toward the edge of consciousness of whatever it was that was accepted
Right.
as conventional. I want to go over this book on Black Power by Jeffrey Ogbar, because, let's see, that's Black Power with
Ogbar.
Radical Politics and African American Identity with Jeffrey Ogbar. I thought this was fascinating. You and I were talking before the program that, the Black Power almost seems a throwback, almost seems archaic as a concept right now, compared to what it was with Black Panthers and really aggressive things back in the 60s and 70s era. And yet it was a profound element in the political landscape.
Hard Work, Remaking the American Labor Movement. Rick Fantasia and Kim Voss. This is a look at sort of the history of American labor, and I guess it comes out of a similar look at the ethics of, well, I shouldn't say the ethics of oppression, but the ethical questions that come out of worker oppression and the sort of the hard work done by labor and the attempts to unite labor,
well, what do
especially
you
a lot
do?
of farm labor
Yeah.
coming out of California.
There's a parallelism to what do you do to make change? And the effort of the traditional American organized labor union movement as it emerged from the 1930s and started to think that all it had to do once it got past the Walter Reuther and UAW radicalism phase and the outright rebellion was just to negotiate contracts, and that the worst challenge workers would have to face might be a strike. But now labor organizers are discovering that this strategy has not borne out so very well. Why even the UAW is considerably diminished in its effectiveness and number of members.
Right.
In the
Having to make a
audio
lot
industry.
A lot of
And
compromises.
organized labor right now is less than 15% of the workforce. And the largest national employer is Walmart, which has 3 to 5 times as many employees as any other corporation in the country, and is ununionized. So there's a good project to go back and try to figure out what did happen, what worked, what didn't work. I don't think it's sufficient just to do hard work. You also have to do smart work. And there was something really significant that was lost in that strategic interaction as time went by, where the American workers thought, if you do the same old, it'd be good enough. It didn't turn out that way very well.
Right. Negotiation, solidarity. The rules are extremely different now. Now this is about what it means to be human. It's a really interesting look. It's entitled at I guess the issue of cloning, but it's actually about biomedicine and the borders of life, actually. It's called Liminal Lives, Imagining the Human at the Frontiers of Biomedicine by Susan Merrill Squire. The cover image is a very sort of a abstract photograph, but of a Petri dish. I mean, it's clearly that's the theme. But she does some interesting things in this book. She looks at sort of the anthropological definition of human life, but also attempts to create new human life. So there's a whole chapter on sort of the science fiction of things like giant babies and oddball shapes, and there's a thing on the popular culture of with imagery and the popular culture of sort of magazine covers and things of that nature that talk about these kind of ghoulish things where you attempt to get transplants and you find bodies to replace and things of that nature. But it's really touching on the whole meaning of how far you can push changing, natural life itself.
It's a notion of virtual beings. What was it? Oh yes, imagine beings in a virtual reality.
There's a lot to it, and you think about the idea of the cyborg, for instance, or the fact that we could be made up of transplanted organs. We could be functioning with organs that were really not naturally there from our or we could be born with, artificial organs of some kind.
Yeah, who are we now? If we're able to fashion and genetically design the who we are, then who are we? And what is our reality? We've kind of gone to that point that is, are we really trying to answer the riddle of the Sphinx? And do we really want to have all the stuff that comes with that? And the next book is Designing Our Descendants, The Promises and Perils of Genetic Modifications by Audrey Chapman and Mark. Boy, this really gets into that same thing.
Same idea, right.
Once we start designing
ethics.
these things, where are we going with that?
Right, and certainly if you're able to predict or able to genetically modify someone so that they're sort of, let's say, the fact that, for instance, take a disease like prostate cancer. If that can actually be genetically modified out of somebody's future history, I mean, I would say that, I think that would be a benefit, but at the same time, that obviously asks questions about what else could be done.
There's no recall you can have on genetic complication once you put that into the human genome pool.
Right.
It's there and it plays out for the rest of,
right.
as long as that gene's there. So you can't say, whoops, we made a mistake, there's not an airbag or something like that. This is kind of a long-term thing.
Yeah.
For this
well,
one.
Let's go for this one now. This is speaking of the memory of genetics. This is the memory and the impact of political transformation in public space by Daniel Walkowitz and Lisa Meyer-Nauer. It's a discussion of monuments, museums, cityscapes, public sites, and the impact of how public action actually transforms society. Andrew Ross, an article on Wallace's Monument and the Resumption of Scotland, the idea of Scotland. An article entitled Aborted Identity, the Commission and Omission of a Monument to the Nation, Sri Lanka, circa 1989. Memory sites and things of that, like To the Disappeared in Chile. And
what's the whole thing of marking the public space? As you know, it went on in Washington, D.C. when we had the huge debate about the Vietnam Memorial, and it's going on now in New York with the huge debate about where do you mark the space where the September 11th events took place.
And they all circle around transformations of some kind because they identify, well, in the case of 9/11, you've got the actual space where the event happened. In the case of the Vietnam War Memorial, you've got this whole debate about the abstract versus I think veterans groups who wanted something very tangible and real, i.e. a bronze statue of actual soldiers who were commemorated. And then how do you represent?
Or do you represent the event? I mean, should the memorial be an abstract evocation
that conjures
of it?
Memory in that sense, right? Or is it something that's tangible and is, physically greater than life-size actual soldiers who dressed in the time of the period?
And then you keep having to balance the space and cost, the long-term cost of doing that memorial that particular way. I think there's a move to have a memorial for Martin Luther King in Washington, D.C.
The other thing this brings to mind is something more current. That is the kind of circulating, city to city, the efforts of activists who are concerned or against the Iraqi war now, commemorating the soldiers that have died in the Iraqi war, building public monuments with, say, 1,000, or at this point, 2,000 crosses, large public things in public squares. And it really is a political activity that is, meant to transform the public arena it's an active monument, but it's
You're bringing up a
short-lived.
very interesting point, and that is that some of these memorials now do travel.
Yeah,
I mean, they
like
have
the quilt, the AIDS quilt. for
the
instance.
AIDS quilt, and the Vietnam Memorial is now has a moving version or
Oh, I didn't know that. Yeah,
portable
okay,
version that's
yeah.
going around. And there's all kinds of things like that where people take the memorial to a town and set it up. So there's awareness to not only having the memorial located in one place,
Right.
kind of a
right.
thing. Let's take this
Yeah, this jurisprudence one kind of touches back on some of the things we had talked about earlier. This is The Jurisprudence of Emergency, Colonialism, and the Rule of Law by Nasser Hussain, who teaches at Amherst College. It's in this series, Law, Meaning, and Violence. I think one of the themes of this is that in order for colonial powers, they talk about the Dutch, the Dutch in Asia, Indonesia, the Indies, the Germans in English and French. In order to consolidate and to sort of create a state and a legal system, they had to create a sense of an emergency that would therefore bring about the need to create some kind of penal code or some kind of imposed legal legal system of some kind, which then took on its own life when the emergency was. It's really about wagging the dog.
Well, see, I like
if you look at it in a contemporary way.
I like this book, which is from the University of Michigan Press, because, again, I have this concern that the United States is trying to justify a whole lot of things by conducting these wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. And we're always claiming that it's an emergency. But how much of an emergency is it when the rationale proves not to be true? Well, that's what we've been doing and our journey through the books. So thank you for being on Rip
Yeah, you're welcome.
again.
It's a slightly different selection than in the past ones we've had.
Yeah.
But, you know, it shows the changes that are going on in terms of the academic press culture as well. There's a lot of, I mean, the talk about globalization issues, especially the new interest in ideas of terrorism, democracy, liberalization.
I like the fact that scholarly literature will attempt to shift over to deal with topics that haven't been dealt with before. And certainly torture, coercive investigations, and violence are being added to the more usual topics of art, culture, and economic well-being. I think that this is one of the social benefits that can come out of serious academic research.
Right.
It's not only benefiting the literature and benefiting fields of study, but it also has a social value.
That has to be discussed in a greater way. But thank you for having me again. It's been a pleasure. Thanks.
It's been my pleasure too.